In the bustling city of Lagos, Nigeria, where dreams were as tall as the skyscrapers and ambitions as vast as the Atlantic Ocean, there lived a man named Richard Blackwood. Born into a modest family in the outskirts of Ibadan, Richard's early life was marked by hardship and struggle. However, from a young age, he possessed an uncanny ability to charm those around him and an insatiable hunger for success. As a child, Richard would watch the fancy cars drive by his family's small compound, promising himself that one day, he'd be the one behind the wheel. His father, a hardworking carpenter, often told him, "Richard, in this world, you either eat or get eaten." These words etched themselves into young Richard's mind, shaping his worldview in ways that would later prove both advantageous and destructive. Richard excelled in school, not because he loved learning, but because he saw education as his ticket out of poverty. He'd charm his teachers with his winning smile and smooth talk, often getting away with mischief that would land other students in trouble. By the time he reached university, Richard had perfected the art of manipulation. At the University of Lagos, Richard studied business administration. While his classmates buried their noses in books, Richard focused on networking. He'd attend every party, every social gathering, always dressed impeccably despite his limited means. It was at one of these parties that he met Chief Adebayo, a wealthy oil tycoon who took a liking to the charismatic young man. Chief Adebayo saw potential in Richard and offered him an internship at his company during the holidays. Richard seized this opportunity with both hands. He worked tirelessly, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. But more importantly, he watched and learned. He observed how Chief Adebayo conducted business, how he negotiated deals, and how he managed his vast network of connections. By the time Richard graduated, he had already laid the groundwork for his future empire. With a glowing recommendation from Chief Adebayo, he secured a job at a prestigious multinational corporation. Richard's rise through the corporate ranks was meteoric. His charm, combined with his sharp business acumen and willingness to bend rules, saw him quickly climb the corporate ladder. But Richard wasn't content with just being a high-ranking executive. He wanted more. He wanted to be the one calling the shots, the one others looked up to with envy and admiration. At the age of 35, Richard took a calculated risk. He resigned from his cushy corporate job and started his own company, Blackwood Enterprises. The early days of Blackwood Enterprises were challenging. Richard poured every naira he had saved into the business. There were nights when he'd sit in his small office, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But Richard's charm and connections soon paid off. Contracts started rolling in, and within 2 years, Blackwood Enterprises had become one of the fastest growing companies in Nigeria. As his wealth grew, so did Richard's appetite for the finer things in life. He bought his first luxury car, a sleek black Mercedes, followed by a penthouse apartment overlooking the Lagos Lagoon. Richard Blackwood had arrived, and he wanted the world to know it. With success came attention, especially from women. Richard had always been popular with the ladies, but now, with his wealth and status, he found himself drowning in female attention. At first, he reveled in it, dating models, actresses, and socialites. Each woman on his arm was more beautiful than the last, a testament to his growing power and influence. However, as time went on, Richard's attitude towards women began to change. He started seeing them not as partners or equals, but as conquests, trophies to be won and discarded. The thrill of the chase became an addiction, a game he played with increasing frequency and decreasing empathy. Richard's friends, other wealthy businessmen, noticed his proclivities and soon, a dangerous game emerged among them. They would bet on who could seduce a particular woman first, treating the whole affair like a sport. Richard, with his charm and resources, often won these bets, further feeding his ego and his distorted view of relationships. As he approached his 40th birthday, Richard Blackwood had it all: money, power, influence, and a black book filled with the names of beautiful women. He had become the man he had always dreamed of being, driving those fancy cars he once watched with envy. But beneath the polished exterior and winning smile, a darkness lurked. Richard's pursuit of success and pleasure had come at a cost, eroding his empathy and moral compass. Little did Richard know that his actions were about to catch up with him. The game he had been playing so recklessly was about to take a deadly turn, one that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. As Richard stood on the balcony of his penthouse, sipping expensive whiskey and looking out over the city he felt he owned, he had no idea that fate was about to deal him a hand he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. The stage was set for a tale of karma, vengeance, and supernatural justice that would send shockwaves through the high society of Lagos. Richard Blackwood's penthouse became the stuff of legend in Lagos high society. Every weekend, the city's elite would gather there for lavish parties that lasted until the early hours of the morning. The air would be thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, the clink of crystal glasses, and the sound of forced laughter as guests tried to curry favor with the powerful host. At the center of it all stood Richard, impeccably dressed in designer suits, a glass of champagne in one hand and often, a beautiful woman on his arm. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, charming, wealthy, and surrounded by beauty. But those who knew him well saw a different side. One such person was Emeka, Richard's childhood friend who had also found success in the business world. Unlike Richard, Emeka had married his university sweetheart and remained faithful to her. He watched with growing concern as Richard's behavior became increasingly reckless. "Richard, my friend," Emeka said one night as they stood on the balcony, away from the party's noise. "Don't you think it's time to settle down? Find a good woman, start a family?" Richard laughed, his eyes scanning the crowd inside for his next potential conquest. "Settle down? Why would I tie myself to one woman when I can have them all?" He gestured towards the party. "Look at 'em, Emeka. They're all here for me. Why should I deny them the pleasure of my company?" Emeka shook his head, recognizing the arrogance in his friend's words. "This game you're playing, it's dangerous. Someone's going to get hurt." But Richard wasn't listening. His attention had been caught by a new arrival, Adana, a stunning model who had just returned from a shoot in Paris. Without another word to Emeka, Richard made his way through the crowd, his predatory gaze fixed on his target. Adana, like many women before her, was quickly swept off her feet by Richard's charm and generosity. He showered her with gifts, designer dresses, diamond jewelry, even a brand new car. For a few weeks, Adana believed she had found her Prince Charming. But soon, the cracks began to show. One evening, as they dined at an exclusive restaurant, Richard's phone buzzed with a message. Adana caught a glimpse of the screen. It was from one of Richard's friends, reminding him of their bet. Her heart sank as she realized she was just another conquest, another notch on Richard's bedpost. Confronted with the truth, Richard didn't even try to deny it. "Come on, darling," he said with a cruel smile. "You didn't think you were special, did you? It's been fun, but I think it's time we end this little arrangement." Adana left the restaurant in tears, another victim of Richard's callousness. But for Richard, it was just another Tuesday. He simply moved on to his next target, never giving Adana a second thought. As months passed, Richard's reputation began to precede him. Women in Lagos high society learned to be wary of his advances, knowing the pain that lay behind his charming smile. But Richard was nothing if not resourceful. He simply widened his net, setting his sights on married women and even the wives of his business associates. One such woman was Folake, the wife of a prominent politician. Richard met her at a charity gala and was immediately taken by her quiet beauty and intelligence. Unlike his usual conquests, Folake presented a challenge. She was well educated, independent, and deeply committed to her marriage. For Richard, this only made the game more exciting. He pursued Folake relentlessly, sending her expensive gifts and flattering messages. He, accidentally, ran into her at social events, always ready with a compliment or a sympathetic ear when she mentioned her husband's busy schedule. Slowly but surely, Folake's resistance began to crumble. She found herself looking forward to Richard's messages, cherishing the attention he lavished on her. When her husband cancelled their anniversary dinner due to a last-minute political engagement, it was Richard who offered a shoulder to cry on. That night, in a moment of weakness, Folake gave in to Richard's advances. The next morning, consumed by guilt, she begged Richard to keep their indiscretion a secret. Richard agreed, but not out of any sense of honor. He had already won his bet with his friends and was ready to move on to his next conquest. As Richard's behavior grew more outrageous, even his friends began to feel uncomfortable. One night, after Richard had seduced and discarded the fiancée of a business rival, his friend Chidi confronted him. "This has gone too far, Richard," Chidi said, his voice low and angry. "You're not just hurting these women anymore. You're destroying families, ruining lives. It needs to stop." Richard, several drinks into the evening, just laughed. "Stop? Why should I stop? I'm Richard Blackwood. I take what I want, when I want it. If these women are foolish enough to fall for me, that's their problem, not mine." Chidi looked at his friend with a mixture of pity and disgust. "One day, Richard, you're going to mess with the wrong woman. And when that day comes, all your money and charm won't be able to save you." Richard dismissed Chidi's warning with a wave of his hand, but the words would come back to haunt him sooner than he could have imagined. It was at his next party that Richard met her, Amara. She stood out from the crowd, not just because of her stunning beauty, but because of the air of mystery that surrounded her. Unlike the other women at the party, Amara didn't fawn over Richard or try to catch his eye. Instead, she remained aloof, observing the proceedings with a hint of amusement. Intrigued by this new challenge, Richard made his way over to Amara. "I don't believe we've met," he said, flashing his most charming smile. "I'm Richard Blackwood." Amara turned to him, her dark eyes seeming to look right through him. "I know who you are, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice cool and composed. "Your reputation precedes you." For the first time in years, Richard felt off balance. There was something about this woman that both attracted and unnerved him. Little did he know that Amara was not what she seemed, and that his encounter with her would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. As the party continued around them, Richard found himself drawn into conversation with Amara. Unlike his usual conquests, she challenged him, matching his wit with her own sharp intellect. For the first time in years, Richard felt a spark of genuine interest. But as he would soon learn, some flames are too dangerous to play with. As the weeks passed, Richard found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Amara. She was unlike any woman he had ever met, intelligent, independent, and seemingly immune to his charms. For the first time in years, Richard felt the thrill of genuine pursuit. He invited Amara to exclusive restaurants, sent her extravagant gifts, and even took her on a weekend getaway to Dubai. Yet, despite his efforts, Amara remained just out of reach. She enjoyed his company but always maintained a careful distance. Richard's friends noticed the change in him. At their regular poker nights, instead of boasting about his latest conquests, Richard would talk about Amara, her wit, her grace, the way she challenged him. "Sounds like our playboy is finally falling in love," teased Chidi one evening. Richard scoffed at the suggestion, but deep down, he felt a flicker of unease. Was he really developing feelings for Amara? The thought both excited and terrified him. As Richard grappled with these unfamiliar emotions, he met another woman who would change the course of his life forever. Her name was Zainab, a young university student who worked part-time as a waitress at one of Richard's favorite restaurants. Zainab was everything Amara wasn't: young, naive, and easily impressed by Richard's wealth and status. When Richard turned his attention to her, showering her with compliments and generous tips, Zainab was quickly swept off her feet. For Richard, pursuing Zainab was a return to familiar territory. Here was a woman he could easily manipulate, a simple conquest to reassure himself that he hadn't lost his touch. He invited her to one of his infamous parties, making sure she felt out of place among the glittering elite of Lagos. As the party wound down, Richard made his move. He invited Zainab to stay behind, promising to show her his art collection. Nervous but flattered, Zainab agreed. In his private study, Richard poured Zainab a glass of expensive champagne. "You know, Zainab," he said, his voice low and seductive, "you're the most beautiful woman at the party tonight." Zainab blushed, unused to such attention. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You're very kind." Richard moved closer, his intentions clear. But as he leaned in to kiss her, Zainab pulled away. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling. I can't. This doesn't feel right." For a moment, Richard was stunned. He wasn't used to rejection, especially not from someone like Zainab. Then, something dark and ugly rose within him. Who was this girl to refuse him? Didn't she know who he was? "Come now, Zainab," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Don't play games. We both know why you're here." He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards him. Zainab's eyes widened in fear. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she pleaded. "I want to leave." But Richard wasn't listening. Years of getting his way, of treating women as objects to be used and discarded, had warped his sense of right and wrong. In his mind, Zainab's refusal was just part of the game, a token resistance to be overcome. What happened next occurred in a blur of violence and terror. Richard, used to always getting his way, tried to force himself on Zainab. She fought back, screaming and struggling against his grip. In the scuffle, Zainab's head struck the corner of Richard's heavy wooden desk. There was a sickening crack, and suddenly, Zainab went limp in Richard's arms. Blood began to pool on the expensive Persian rug. Richard stared in horror at Zainab's still form. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just supposed to be another conquest, another notch on his bedpost. Now, a young woman lay dead in his study, her unseeing eyes staring accusingly at him. Panic set in. Richard's mind raced. He couldn't call the police. His reputation, his business, everything he had built would be destroyed. With shaking hands, he reached for his phone and dialed the only people he thought he could trust. Within an hour, Chidi and two other friends arrived at Richard's penthouse. They found him sitting in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring blankly at Zainab's body. "Jesus Christ, Richard," Chidi exclaimed. "What have you done?" Richard looked up at his friends, his eyes wild with fear. "It was an accident," he said, his voice hoarse. She fell. You have to help me. Please." The friends exchanged grim looks. They had always known Richard's behavior would lead to trouble, but this was beyond anything they had imagined. Yet, bound by years of friendship and shared secrets, they knew they had no choice but to help. Working quickly and efficiently, they wrapped Zainab's body in a rug. Under the cover of darkness, they carried her to Chidi's SUV. They drove to a remote area outside the city, where they buried Zainab in a shallow grave. As they drove back to Lagos in silence, each man was lost in his own thoughts. They had crossed a line tonight, become complicit in something unforgivable. Nothing would ever be the same. Back at his penthouse, Richard poured himself another drink, his hands still shaking. He had gotten away with it. No one would ever know what had happened to Zainab. Tomorrow, he would go back to his life, to his pursuit of Amara, as if nothing had happened. But as he stood on his balcony, looking out over the city he thought he owned, Richard felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time in his life, he felt truly afraid. Not of the police or of being caught, but of something he couldn't quite name, a sense that the universe had shifted, that a cosmic scale had tipped against him. Little did Richard know, but at that very moment, in the spirit realm, Zainab's soul cried out for justice. Her tears, filled with the pain of her unjust death, rippled through the spiritual plane, catching the attention of forces beyond mortal understanding. In the coming days, as Richard tried to go back to his normal life, he found himself plagued by nightmares. He would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear Zainab's screams echoing in his bedroom. During the day, he thought he caught glimpses of her out of the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. His friends, too, were affected. Chidi became withdrawn, drinking heavily to dull the guilt. The others avoided Richard, making excuses not to see him. The easy camaraderie of the group was shattered, replaced by a heavy, unspoken burden. As for Amara, Richard found himself desperately clinging to her presence. She represented normalcy, a link to the life he had before that fateful night. He showered her with even more attention, almost frantic in his pursuit. But Amara sensed the change in him. There was a desperation in Richard's eyes now, a haunted look that hadn't been there before. She began to pull away, confused and slightly alarmed by his intensity. Richard, in his growing paranoia, misinterpreted her distance as a challenge. He became determined to win her over, to prove to himself that he was still the same Richard Blackwood, that the incident with Zainab hadn't changed him. Little did he know, but his obsession with Amara would lead him down a path from which there was no return. For Amara was not who she appeared to be, and the forces of vengeance were already closing in on Richard Blackwood. In the spirit realm, Zainab's cries for justice did not go unheard. Her tears, filled with the pain of her unjust death, reached the throne of the Queen of Spirits. Known as Eri in the mortal world, the Queen of Spirits was a powerful entity, responsible for maintaining balance between the world of the living and the dead. Eri listened to Zainab's plea, her ancient eyes filling with sorrow at the young woman's fate. She had watched Richard Blackwood for years, seeing how his actions had caused pain and suffering to countless women. Now, with Zainab's death, the scales had tipped too far. It was time for justice to be served. With a wave of her hand, Eri summoned Amara, one of her most trusted spirit agents. "You have done well in observing Richard Blackwood," Eri said, her voice like the whisper of wind through leaves. "Now, it is time to bring him to justice." Amara bowed her head in acknowledgement. She had been in the mortal world for months, taking on human form to get close to Richard. She had seen firsthand the devastation he caused, the lives he ruined with his selfish actions. Now, she would be the instrument of his downfall. Meanwhile, in the mortal world, Richard's life was unraveling. His nights were plagued by vivid nightmares of Zainab's death. During the day, he was jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting to see Zainab's ghost. His business began to suffer as he missed meetings and made erratic decisions. His friends, unable to bear the weight of the shared secret, avoided him. Richard found himself increasingly isolated, with only Amara as his lifeline to normalcy. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his study, drowning his sorrows in expensive whiskey, his phone buzzed with a message from Amara. She wanted to see him, to talk about their relationship. Richard's heart leaped. This was his chance to solidify things with Amara, to prove to himself that he was still the same Richard Blackwood. He quickly sent a reply, inviting her to his penthouse. As he waited for her arrival, Richard paced nervously, rehearsing what he would say. He needed this to go perfectly. Amara was his last chance at redemption, his opportunity to start anew. When Amara arrived, she was more beautiful than ever. She wore a flowing white dress that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of Richard's penthouse. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, now held a strange, otherworldly gleam. "Richard," she said, her voice soft yet somehow filling the entire room. "We need to talk." Richard, his charm failing him for once, simply nodded and led her to the study. As they entered the room, he felt a chill run down his spine. This was where Zainab had died. For a moment, he thought he could see a dark stain on the carpet where her blood had spilled. Amara walked to the center of the room and turned to face Richard. "Do you know why I'm here, Richard?" she asked, her voice taking on an eerie quality. Richard, unnerved by her tone, tried to regain control of the situation. He stepped towards her, reaching out to take her hand. "Amara, my love, I've been thinking. You and I, were perfect for each other. I want us to be together, officially. I'm ready to change, to be the man you deserve." But as he reached for her, Amara stepped back. Her form seemed to flicker, like a candle in the wind. "Oh, Richard," she said, a note of pity in her voice. "It's too late for that. Far too late." Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. The lights flickered, and Richard heard what sounded like whispers coming from the walls. His eyes widened in terror as he saw faces forming in the shadows, faces of women he had used and discarded over the years. What is this?" he stammered, backing away from Amara. "What's happening?" Amara's form shimmered again, and suddenly she was no longer the beautiful woman Richard had pursued. In her place stood a being of pure light, her eyes filled with the wisdom of ages. "I am Amara, servant of Eri, the Queen of Spirits," she proclaimed, her voice echoing with power. "I have come to bring justice for all the women you have wronged, Richard Blackwood." But most of all, I am here for Zainab. At the mention of Zainab's name, Richard fell to his knees. Please, he begged, all pretense of charm and confidence gone. It was an accident. I never meant to kill her. But you did mean to use her, to force yourself upon her, Amara replied, her voice cold. Just as you have done to countless women before her. Your actions have caused pain and suffering, Richard. And now, you must face the consequences. The whispers grew louder, and Richard watched in horror as ghostly figures began to materialize around him. He recognized some of them, women he had seduced and abandoned, wives whose marriages he had destroyed, even Zainab, her eyes sad and accusing. No, Richard whimpered, covering his eyes. This isn't real. It can't be real. But when he opened his eyes again, the spirits were still there. And now, from the shadows, emerged a new figure, a woman of incredible beauty and terrible power. She wore a crown of stars and her eyes held the depths of the universe. Richard Blackwood, she spoke, her voice like thunder. I am Eri, Queen of Spirits. You stand accused of causing great pain and suffering in the mortal world. How do you plead? Richard, overcome with terror, could only stare in mute horror. His mind, unable to process what was happening, simply shut down. Eri turned to the assembled spirits. You who have suffered at the hands of this man, what is your judgment? The spirits spoke as one, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. Let him feel the pain he has caused. Let him know the suffering he has inflicted. Eri nodded solemnly. She raised her hand, and Richard felt a searing pain in his chest. It was as if every hurt he had ever caused, every heart he had broken, every life he had ruined, was being poured into him at once. He screamed, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the penthouse. But no one would come to his aid. His friends, bound by their complicity in Zainab's death, had abandoned him. The women he had used were here now, witnessing his judgment. As the pain reached its peak, Richard felt something inside him break. In that moment, he understood the true weight of his actions, the lives he had carelessly damaged in pursuit of his own pleasure. Tears streamed down his face as remorse, true remorse, filled him for the first time. I'm sorry, he sobbed, looking at the spirits around him. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. Eri's expression softened slightly. Remorse is the first step towards redemption, Richard Blackwood. But your journey is far from over. With a wave of her hand, the pain subsided. Richard collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. You will live, Richard Blackwood, Eri declared. But you will live with the full knowledge and feeling of the pain you have caused. Your wealth, your charm, your power, all of it will be stripped away. You will spend the rest of your days working to make amends for your actions. As she spoke, Richard felt a change come over him. The confident, charismatic man he had been was gone, replaced by someone humbled and broken. He knew, with crushing certainty, that his life as he knew it was over. Eri turned to Zainab's spirit. Your death will not go unavenged, child. Justice has been served. Zainab's spirit smiled sadly and nodded before fading away along with the other spirits. Eri and Amara were the last to disappear, leaving Richard alone in his study. In the days that followed, Richard's empire crumbled. Anonymous tips led the police to evidence of his financial crimes. His friends, fearing for themselves, turned against him, revealing the truth about Zainab's death. Richard found himself arrested, his name splashed across the newspapers he once controlled. But as he sat in his prison cell, awaiting trial, Richard felt a strange sense of peace. The crushing guilt he carried was still there, but alongside it was a determination to do better, to make amends for his past actions. He knew his road to redemption would be long and difficult, but for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwood was ready to face the consequences of his actions and work towards becoming a better person. And somewhere in the spirit realm, Eri watched, knowing that balance had been restored, justice had been served, and perhaps, just perhaps, a soul had been set on the path to redemption.